Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the hidden chapters of history, seeking those quiet moments that shaped our world. Whether you're snuggled up for the night or drifting off with your eyes closed, I'm truly glad you're spending this calm moment with me. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you starting your day or settling down with the past whispering in your ears? If you enjoy these reflective journeys through time, do consider subscribing. There are many peaceful nights still ahead. Now, picture a world where the simple act of finding food could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine waking to the sound of church bells slicing through morning mist. But instead of a call to prayer, it's a warning. The harvest has failed again. Granaries are nearly empty and it's only autumn. This is medieval Europe, where famine was a predator and survival, an everyday struggle. Today we'll uncover how people in that era endured starvation using ingenious, desperate, and at times unsettling methods. These weren't random acts of desperation. Over centuries, medieval communities developed complex survival systems showing extraordinary human resilience. From rationing techniques that extended supplies for months to identifying wild foods and creating support networks, they prepared for the worst and adapted with astonishing tenacity. Perhaps most fascinating was their ability not just to endure famine, but to predict and prepare for it. Long before modern weather science, medieval farmers became keen observers. They watched animal behavior, tracked moon phases, noticed tree bark texture, and bird migrations. These weren't superstitions, but predictive systems honed by generations. Village elders mentally recorded weather patterns and crop cycles. They knew trouble was coming when certain signs aligned a severe winter. Late spring, unusual insect activity, or changes in leaf color. These signs triggered a network of preparation strategies refined over time. First came preservation, medieval. People were experts at making food last, salting meat, drying fruits, and storing grain with skill that rivals modern techniques. Then came knowledge of famine foods, edible wild plants, tree bark, and roots. Foragers, often older women, passed down the knowledge of which parts of a plant to use and how to safely prepare foods that might otherwise be toxic. The social aspect of survival was just as important. Villages maintained complex systems of mutual aid. Wealthier families contributed to communal stores in good times, knowing support would come in bad times. Churches played a vital role, not only promoting charity, but also coordinating aid. When famine struck, food was rationed community-wide, not just within families. Who got how much was decided collectively, often considering age, health, and community roles. They also innovated food production. When crops failed, they grew hardy grains, gathered fast-growing plants, and carefully managed livestock. Survival wasn't about luxury, but having just enough and knowing how to stretch it. Their strategies were built on flexibility, knowledge, and cooperation, valuable lessons even today as we continue. You'll see how medieval people turned hardship into innovation and community strength. But even with preparation, some famines overwhelmed entire regions. As stores ran dry and wild foods vanished, hard choices followed. Starvation crept slowly, and its first victims were often children. Malnutrition showed quickly, fading laughter. Sunken cheeks, dull eyes, mothers skipped meals to feed children, elders faded quietly. Under such pressure, families faced impossible choices. Should the last grain go to the strongest, or to the weakest who needed it most? Some parents abandoned infants at monastery gates, praying for a miracle. Social structures buckled. Hungry peasants eyed noble stores. Feudal respect gave way to riots as starving villagers stormed estates. Yet even then, some communities remained united. Where mutual aid had been strong, new cooperation emerged. Neighbors pooled resources with precision. Churches and monasteries became anchors of hope. Monks skilled in fasting used that discipline to ration food wisely, feeding thin broths to lines of the desperate. Every portion measured to sustain. Life without exhausting supplies, the emotional cost was deep. Hunger changed personalities. Farmers grew paranoid, hoarding crumbs. Children lied about being full. Adults betrayed neighbors. Yet hope clung on. Some still shared their last crusts, tended to the sick, sang to orphans. These quiet heroes, mostly unnamed by history, preserved dignity in ruin. Famine survival meant redefining food itself. Tree bark, when ground and boiled, became flour. The inner bark of birch and oak offered rough sustenance. Leaves and grass turned into bitter. Teas roots normally fed to livestock became essential. Even leather was boiled into unappetizing broths. Families passed down methods for preparing such fare. Mental adjustment was as vital as physical endurance. People had to embrace foods they once saw as trash. Parents taught children gratitude for bark or broth. As famine stretched on, forests, emptied fields were stripped, and scavenging expanded. Then came the darkest strategies: boiled book bindings, ground bones from graves, and more. Some nobles exploited the crisis, hoarding food and selling adulterated bread at high prices. Resentment burned, lasting generations. Others, though, embraced compassion. Villages created shared kitchens. Families gave what little they had to. A common pot, feeding everyone equally. Women were key in these times. As keepers of the home, they managed supplies with brilliance. They shared foraging knowledge, crafted meals from nearly nothing, and redistributed their portions to their children without complaint. Their informal networks kept entire communities informed and connected. The land bore the scars of famine-stripped trees, dug-up roots, ravaged fields. Survivors bore psychological wounds just as lasting. Many hoarded food even years later. Children who starved became adults, unable to waste a crumb. Yet through all this, humanity endured. Even in hunger, people kept their dignity. They cared. For each other, they planned for tomorrow, they hoped. And in that hope, they left us lessons about endurance, community, and the remarkable strength of the human spirit. Tested in the harshest crucibles of suffering, famine survival became perhaps the most vital lesson humanity ever learned. The children who endured these famines carried with them not only trauma, but the hard-earned knowledge that had preserved their lives. They became walking archives of survival, guardians of ancient, painful wisdom about how communities could persist even when the world seemed determined to destroy them. Their stories, handed down through generations, became warnings and teachings, preparing future communities for the inevitable return of hunger. In this way, medieval famines became laboratories of endurance, places where human resilience was refined. The strategies born from these dark times were not simply about finding food in barren landscapes. They were blueprints for preserving community, hope, and the most vulnerable, even when every resource had vanished. As scarcity deepened, so too did the desperation. When the last grain had been consumed, when preserved meats had vanished, and even bark bread became a distant luxury, people were pushed into choices unimaginable in more plentiful times. The descent began subtly. Leather goods, shoes, belts, saddles took on new life as potential meals. Boiled for hours, sometimes days, leather softened into a bitter, gelatinous broth. It had little nutrition but filled stomachs and brought comfort. But leather was only the beginning. Bark became a staple, especially the inner layers of birch, pine, and oak. People stripped trees carefully to reach the cambium, which they ground into flour. This laborious process required sudden expertise. Removing too much bark killed trees, endangering future meals. Too little and families starved. Communities developed sustainable methods, rotating harvests and preserving forest. Resources even more desperate were sawdust and wood shavings. Carpenter workshops became prized for their waste, which was boiled and strained into something technically edible, though nearly void of nutrients and dangerous to digest. Most difficult to modern sensibilities was the systematic consumption of bone. Cleaned bones were cracked, boiled, powdered, and added to meals. Old bones, dug up or scavenged, were processed for every last nutrient. Wild greens, dandelions, nettles, garlic fed families. Children, some as young as 5, became skilled foragers, distinguishing safe from toxic flora. Their abilities often decided the fate of entire families. This transformation in diet reshaped minds as much as bodies. People weren't simply switching meals, they were redefining food. Cultural taboos shattered. Religious laws were suspended. Class-based diets dissolved when survival took precedence. Whole communities had to agree that old food customs no longer applied. Elders who once enforced tradition now led in abandoning it. Priests who preached against non-Christian foods now bless bark and leather. New knowledge emerged. Famine food experts often. Women experimented with preparation methods, searching for safer, more nutritious combinations. Children raised in famine learned early that anything organic could be consumed if properly prepared. Social norms around sharing changed too. In a world of bark and bone meals, generosity and hoarding took new forms. Some shared survival knowledge openly. Others protected it fiercely. Trade transformed. Bark, leather, and wild plants replaced meat and grain. Waste became currency. The value of food flipped, a handful of grain worth more than luxury goods. Yet people didn't simply accept these changes, they improved them. Recipes, techniques, and rituals evolved to make famine food palatable and mentally comforting. Cookbooks from the time detail bark preparation, leather softening methods, and combined meals using famine ingredients. This was about more than staying alive. It was about preserving human dignity. Amid despair, communities leaned on mutual aid systems shaped by generations of hardship. Church bells signaled rationing. Elders gathered to inventory and redistribute every remaining food item. With young children, pregnant women, skilled workers like blacksmiths or herbalists received priority, not from favoritism, but because their roles were vital. Women organized communal kitchens, stretched meals to feed dozens, and passed on preservation skills that could mean survival through winter. Children became foraging experts under their mother's guidance, memorizing the locations of wild edibles and streams. Psychologically, these changes were monumental. Hierarchies collapsed. Lords opened their stores. Religious restrictions eased. Feast days became humble, thanks for anything edible, yet the burden was severe. Parents agonized over who should eat. Neighbors eyed each other's stores with desperation. Hunger warped minds. Some became obsessed with foraging and hoarding. Others fell into silence and stillness, conserving energy. Medieval life's normal rhythms, markets, festivals, visits vanished as all attention turned to survival. Faith, once a comfort, became both shield and question. People prayed fervently, carried relics in processions, and wondered aloud why God allowed such suffering. Priests fasted beside the starving, hoping their sacrifice might bring divine mercy. In medieval Scotland, these horrors grew worse. The famines here were not mere hunger, but cataclysms that stripped away civilization. A cold spring or endlessly wet summer marked doom. Elders read the signs in silence, remembering stories of God turning from the land. When the crop failure became undeniable, calm settled, not peace, but surrender. Rationing began. Each turnip, each grain counted, but no arithmetic could save them. Stores ran out in weeks. The next harvest was months away. Survival demanded invention. Animals were killed, livestock, pigs, chickens even, if it meant sacrificing. The future? Meat bought time, but doomed seasons ahead. They had, quite literally, eaten tomorrow. Then the true desperation began. Famine foods returned, roots, barks, grasses. Women held this knowledge, whispered down like sacred lore. Oak bark could be powdered. Birch inner bark filled bellies. Acorns were leached of toxins. Grass boiled into bitter broth. Children identified wild plants with uncanny skill, choosing life over poison. Leather became food. Shoes, belts, harnesses, anything boiled to jelly. Bones long buried were retrieved, boiled, reboiled, and ground to dust.
Else.
Each bite was a surrender of dignity, yet also an act of resilience. Community bonds became lifelines. People taught each other survival skills. Women worked together too. Make the inedible edible. Children suffered, the most distended bellies, spindly limbs, hollow eyes. Many could not survive on bark and broth. Faith became both solace and torment. Some trusted God's plan. Others questioned his mercy, yet still they endured. As famines dragged on, society unraveled. Social order collapsed. Trade stopped. Roads grew dangerous. Loyalty strained as families chose between sharing and surviving. Yet remarkably, many communities emerged with humanity intact. Shared hunger united them across class and status. The knowledge born in these trials became Lagosia's grim inheritance, ensuring the next generation would never forget the price of survival. Recovery brought new challenges. Weak bodies invited illness, and the road back to health was long. The people of medieval Scotland had endured the unthinkable, and in doing so, they proved that even when stripped of all else, human resilience could still shine in the darkness. The bodies of survivors, once forced to digest bark and grass, needed careful readjustment before they could handle regular meals again. Many who outlasted the worst of the hunger soon fell ill. Their systems were simply too damaged to fully recover. The emotional wounds ran deeper still. Those who had eaten leather and tree bark carried the weight of that humiliation throughout their lives. The memory of oak bark broth, of chewing boiled shoes, and of searching desperately for wild greens became permanent parts of their identity. These memories influenced their view of food and safety for years. Even when food was more abundant, they would stockpile supplies and watch the woods with cautious eyes, knowing that one bad harvest could undo everything. But out of these dark times came lasting ideas. People created new ways to preserve food and stretch what little they had. Skills that remained useful long after the crisis had ended. Knowledge of which wild plants could be safely eaten became better organized, passed down to protect future generations. Communities created early warning systems and support networks, ready to act at the first signs of trouble. The children who lived through these events didn't just carry pain, they carried strength. They learned not to waste, to value what others ignored, and to prepare with a seriousness born from survival. These lessons, forged in suffering, became woven into the culture of medieval Scottish society, seen from today's world. The fact that these communities survived such extreme challenges is a powerful testament to human determination. Without the safety nets we now have, no modern science, no global food trade, these people faced starvation, armed only with tradition, cooperation, and grit. That Scottish life continued, and even thrived, despite repeated disasters, speaks volumes about the strength of the human spirit. Every generation that endured added to the community's collective wisdom and will. But making it through years of hunger required more than strong individuals. It demanded a complete change in how society worked. The villages that fared best weren't necessarily the richest or best located. They were the ones willing to rethink everything. WWII, a village in the Yorkshire Dales during the devastating 1315 to 1322 famine, showed exactly that spirit. Their strength wasn't wealth or land, it was the courage to reimagine society in crisis. When crops began to fail in 1315, their leaders didn't just wait and hope. They formed what they called the Council of Necessity, a bold idea that brought together not just the powerful, but also the wise women, the oldest farmers, the miller, the blacksmith, and even the poorest villagers. This group built what we'd now call an emergency response plan, using only the knowledge and tools of the time. First, they created a grand inventory, recording every bit of food, every seed, tool, and skill within reach. Women long excluded from official decisions saw their knowledge of herbs and food storage suddenly become critical. Children were formed into foraging groups, their small fingers perfect for finding seeds and roots adults might miss. But perhaps their biggest change came with the hunger law's new rules that reshaped society based on contribution rather than birth. Even the Lord's meals were rationed like everyone else's. The priest gave up his grain tithe and shared meals in the public kitchen. Couples postponed weddings, not from lack of love, but because one less mouth meant more for those left behind. These shifts took a deep emotional toll. For generations, medieval people had believed in a certain world order in seasons, harvests, and their place in society. Famine didn't just attack their bodies, it shattered their worldview. Chords from the time describe a spiritual hunger, a collapse of belief. In one monastery, Brother Thomas wrote of hunger madness that struck people in 1317. Some sat for hours, staring into empty bowls, unable to grasp that food would not come. Others hoarded tiny bits of food, hiding them so well they starved. With supplies feet away, this mental strain sparked new survival tactics. In Little Compton, village began feast memories, storytelling sessions, where villagers described past meals in rich detail. At first, it seemed cruel, torturing the hungry with tales of food. But over time, these sessions became memory training, preserving knowledge of recipes, food sources, and survival tricks. Memory became a survival tool. Work also changed. Old divisions by gender, age, and status blurred. In Saltmere, women took to sea fishing when men grew too weak. Children, just 8 years old, repaired fishing gear with nimble hands. The most important shift, though, was a new way of thinking, what chroniclers called famine consciousness. Before the famine, life was planned 1 year at a time. But now, decisions were made for years ahead. Seeds were saved not just for the next planting, but the one after that. In Westbrook, villagers created a 7-year plan, preparing for a famine far worse than anyone expected. Some fields were left untouched, even as hunger raged, to protect future soil. This demanded deep trust. A hungry mother had to resist feeding her child from fertile fields. Elders had to convince the young not to slaughter breeding animals for one meal. Communication also changed. In Moheath, hunger runners carried news between villages, food discoveries, foraging sites, survival tips. They also warned of starving groups migrating from failed settlements. Some villages welcomed these outsiders with care, like Thornwick, which set up trial periods for newcomers to join. Others, like Grimthorpe, barred outsiders entirely, even starving children. These harsh choices haunted them, but leaders insisted that saving some meant refusing others. Religion also adapted. Traditional teachings of charity clashed with the needs of rationing. Some priests, like Father Benedict of Millfield, preached a gospel of preservation that saving some was better than letting all perish. Others, like Sister Marguerite of Blackmore Abbey, opened their doors to all, believing faith meant trusting divine provision. Strangely, both kinds of communities often survived, showing that the clarity of belief and shared purpose mattered. As much as the policy itself, famine also drove technical progress. In Ironbridge, villagers made hunger tools, ultrafine sieves for husks, digging tools for deep roots, and stones that ground inedible scraps into food. They built efficiency. Fire special stone ovens that burned for hours with minimal fuel. These fire techniques were guarded like treasure. Food storage also advanced. Fermentation methods improved, turning spoiled milk into famine cheese that lasted months. They even used natural freeze-drying, cold air, and dry winds to preserve food. These methods needed precise skill and attention, turning food storage into a complex science. But it was in social systems that famine pushed the greatest changes. Villages like Westmarch created the Hunger Parliament, daily meetings where all adults could speak, suggest ideas, and help make decisions. These weren't typical feudal councils. A peasant woman's experience might outweigh a noble's. Title: Children's Insights could shape village plans. Was governance based on need, knowledge, and results. The Hunger Parliament even introduced future talking, time set aside each day to dream of life after the famine. These talks kept spirits alive, preserved non-essential knowledge, and gave people hope. The children born during these times, called hunger babies in records, grew up with skills and toughness beyond their years. They made games from foraging, songs to remember food caches, and jokes that kept their parents going. When the famine finally ended, surviving villages faced a choice: keep these changes or return to old ways. Some, like Thornwick, held on to their new systems, seeing value in collective planning. Others quickly reverted, weary of the strain. But all carried the mark of survival, the knowledge that human societies can transform under pressure. These famine-born generations had seen status dissolve, decisions democratized, and creativity bloom in the harshest conditions. Their legacy wasn't just survival, it was a blueprint for resilience. Villages that endured became models for others, their lessons echoing across Europe. And now, as we look at these strategies, we turn to the most sensitive topic of all: how communities decided who lived and who didn't when there simply wasn't enough to go around. Extended far beyond the immediate crisis, mutual obligations shaped the medieval social landscape. A family that received extra rations during a harsh winter might be expected to offer labor or resources to others once times improved. A craftsman, who survived due to his essential skills during famine, would often prioritize community needs over personal gain during recovery. These were not mere economic exchanges, they were deep moral commitments that united families and entire communities. For generations, surviving famine was as much psychological as it was physical. Medieval people understood that keeping morale and social unity intact was essential during prolonged hardship. They developed rituals and practices aimed at reinforcing communal bonds and sustaining hope. Religious observances played a key role, just for spiritual solace, but for preserving societal structure. Communities introduced fasting days, where everyone would collectively eat less as a form of shared sacrifice. Even in dire shortages, feast days were observed with symbolic meals made from pooled resources, reminding everyone of better times and a shared will to endure. Storytelling and communal entertainment also served crucial functions. Elders would gather villagers to tell traditional stories, emphasizing perseverance, unity, and redemption. These weren't just distractions, they preserved cultural memory and reinforced shared values needed for rebuilding after the crisis. Remarkably, medieval societies developed informal yet effective early warning systems that reached beyond local boundaries. Networks of messengers, traders, and religious pilgrims kept communities connected. When news arrived that another village had found new food sources or preservation methods, delegations would travel to learn and adopt these strategies. Communities that had endured earlier famines sent advisors to aid others in distress. These mutual aid systems built regional resilience that no isolated community could achieve alone. Women played a central role in famine survival, often becoming the primary stewards of household resources and community care. While men sought work or food elsewhere, women managed survival on the ground, stretching supplies, organizing communal kitchens, tending to the sick and elderly, and sustaining the social fabric. Their deep knowledge of food preservation, seasonal cycles, and wild edibles became critical. Women knew how to manage scarcity through traditional recipes and plant knowledge, sometimes being relied upon even by decision-making councils that normally excluded them. The long-term impact of famine, survival reshaped communities. Villages that made it through tough times emerged with stronger bonds, better systems for managing resources, and greater preparedness for future challenges. These famine generations carried with them enduring lessons about cooperation, conservation, and solidarity. Communities formalized abundance protocols, systems for managing plenty to prepare for scarcity. Permanent grain stores, coordinated regional responses, and cultural traditions emphasizing sharing became the norm. The medieval famine response reveals the importance of social cohesion, foresight, and cooperation in navigating existential threats. These communities weren't aimlessly struggling, they developed complex, effective strategies rooted in shared values. Their success came not just from individual skill, but from preserving social bonds and commitments when survival seemed nearly impossible. As we reflect on their legacy, we see how their collective strategies shaped European society for generations. Faced with the collapse of food systems, medieval people went beyond traditional survival and embraced crisis adaptation or redefinition of daily life that preserved human dignity. They developed an expanded dietary awareness, turning to famine foods and forgotten sources of nutrition. Tree bark, for example, was dried, ground, and used to extend flour. Boiled leather goods, cracked bones, and fish bones became essential supplements. These weren't random acts of desperation, they were based on inherited knowledge, preparation, techniques, and calculated nutritional decisions. They knew how to render leather digestible, how to flavor broths with wild herbs, and how to safely use every part of an animal or plant. Ground bones and rich stews. Fish bones provided calcium for pregnant women, and animal hides were processed for their gelatin content. The plant world offered even more. Acorns were leached of bitterness, wild garlic and dandelions became staples, and seasonal planning helped communities predict when certain edibles would be available. They even encouraged the growth of wild vegetables near villages. This wasn't foraging, it was a kind of ecological agriculture. Sharing knowledge was crucial. Communities created systems to teach safe preparation methods, especially for potentially dangerous food. Older women passed down protocols from testing new ingredients in small amounts to preserving famine foods. Redistribution systems prioritized children, pregnant women, and essential workers. Religious leaders played a key role, reframing unusual diets as morally justified under the circumstances, allowing communities to maintain spiritual identity. Food preparation became communal, strengthening bonds and providing space for shared resilience. Songs, stories, and rituals helped make meals feel meaningful. Women led the charge in innovation masking bitterness, creating new combinations, and even engineering better nutrition through mixed ingredients. Nutrition knowledge grew more sophisticated, allowing health to be maintained even on meager diets. People knew how to prevent disease through dietary choices, support pregnant mothers, and preserve children's growth. Crucially, they preserved food, culture, and dignity. Even with extreme scarcity, they celebrated meals, cooked together, and kept traditions alive. Oral traditions preserved survival techniques as emotional and cultural knowledge, ensuring future generations had tools and hope in future crises. Expanded diets were temporary, but the wisdom they generated became permanent. Communities learned to survive without losing their humanity, adapting fundamentally while holding on to shared values. This deep resilience wasn't just about food, it was about redefining survival as a moral and communal endeavor. As our exploration continues, we turn to the most advanced aspect of medieval survival, their networks of mutual aid. These complex systems were among the earliest forms of organized crisis response. Instead of isolating in hardship, communities activated long-standing ties that spanned regions. Everyone understood today's helper might be tomorrow's one in need. Religious institutions like monasteries played central roles. They were more than spiritual centers, they were crisis coordination hubs. They kept track of regional conditions, managed food reserves, and facilitated the transfer of aid. Traveling monks and clergy acted as mobile information centers, spreading news and survival strategies. Even feuding nobles collaborated when survival was at stake, using marriage, trade, and alliances to deliver seed grain, shelter, or protection. These networks worked on multiple levels. Royal courts coordinated relief across kingdoms, while regional lords helped neighboring territories. Villages shared tools, labor, and knowledge. Merchants and traders were essential links, carrying goods, news, and identifying where help was needed. Their understanding of terrain, timing, and local economics allowed them to match surplus to shortage quickly. These systems also enabled the rapid spread of innovation. Food preservation method discovered in one village could spread across dozens in a season. Communities refined techniques as they passed through networks. Seasonal timing became critical. Early harvests helped neighbors. Coastal towns traded fish inland. Mountain villages provided materials in exchange for grain. Women were key players here too. Noble women shared letters and coordinated aid. Merchant wives handled logistics, and peasant women maintained informal ties through family and pilgrimage routes. The church calendar gave rhythm to these efforts, with festivals and pilgrimages creating moments for coordination. Pilgrims acted as news carriers. Monasteries served as safe meeting points. During crises like the Black Death, These networks saved lives. Communities shared treatments, cared for orphans, and reallocated resources. When authority collapsed, networks stepped in. They adapted to war, avoiding danger zones through hidden routes known by outcasts or refugees. Even when kingdoms fell, these relationships endured. Economically, these networks acted like insurance. Risk was shared, enabling communities to take chances, innovate, and no help would be available. Constant knowledge exchange pushed societies forward, good ideas spread. Failed ones vanished. Survival in medieval times was profoundly social. The strongest communities built connections, maintained them, and used them when it mattered most. These networks were a powerful innovation proof that human cooperation and foresight can overcome even the harshest conditions. Finally, the preservation and sharing of survival knowledge was critical. Villages that survived often did so because they remembered how women, especially older matriarchs, served as living libraries. They remembered wild food locations, harvest timing, and how to turn bark or weeds into meals. They taught the safe use of inedible-looking items, maximizing nutrition. Where literate scribes or monks existed, they documented what worked: food rotation, community coordination, and the best wild plants for each season. These records guided future generations. Early warning systems were also crucial. People read nature like a map: early bird migrations, restless livestock changing. Some methods had failed in past emergencies, while others had proven remarkably effective. Councils of elders played a crucial role in shaping key decisions: when to start rationing food, how to equitably distribute dwindling supplies, and when to risk dispatching search parties in hope of finding alternate food sources. Religious centers also became vital coordinators during widespread disasters. Monasteries acted as communication hubs, sending trusted messengers to affiliated institutions spread across distant regions. These networks enabled consistent updates on local situations and allowed successful relief strategies to spread quickly. This interconnection helped ensure that food surpluses from more fortunate areas could be directed toward those facing severe shortages. Another central survival method was the careful preservation of seed stocks. Communities devised detailed plans to protect the genetic diversity of their crops, preserving multiple strains of grain and vegetables. Each adapted to different environmental pressures. Leaders recognized that losing any variety could jeopardize future harvests, so even in dire circumstances, they prioritized the safeguarding of breeding seeds. Strong trade relationships, often established during times of abundance, became lifelines during crisis. Villages that had nurtured bonds with neighboring settlements could rely on these alliances for mutual aid. Many such agreements were formalized through marriages or treaties, providing protection that extended far beyond a single village. In times of primary crop failure, innovation emerged. Emergency crops were cultivated, hardy roots that stayed edible underground through winter, quick-growing grains, and fast-sprouting vegetables that delivered sustenance within weeks. Formed part of the evolving survival playbook, refined over generations to withstand recurring famine.